distinguishable from those of a woman. This accusation should not be accepted, of course, without caution and suspicion, not least because Aeschines had a good reason to attack his opponent. It is not a known fact, in other words, that Demosthenes chooses Kinaitic attire. But what Aeschines says, that others perceive one's attire in specific ways that may be divergent from one's self-perception, is in principle true. Aeschines also says that despite Timarchus being a male in body, he has committed the hamartia, the grave mistake of a woman. This is in section 185 in speech 1. The exact nature of this hamartia is unstated in the text, but it is highly likely to be prostitution with men and the treatment of a male body as if it belonged to a woman. Effeminacy, perhaps manifested through performance, is thought to distort manliness in the extreme. So whether the description of Timarchus in Aeschines' one effectively approximates to the description of Echinaidos, and thus implicitly attributes to him the bodily and behavioral manners that ancient sources argue the figure is characterized by, is most unclear. The speaker never openly accuses Timarchus of Kinaidia, as he does on the contrary with Demosthenes, when he compares his garments with those of a woman. This is another form of silence in language, another oxymoron to puzzle us. I will not side with Professor Nick Fisher, however, in arguing that Timarchus is emphatically not presented as a Kinaidos in speech 1. There are, in my view, silent pointers to his sexual and gender nature, behavior, and practices. The passages, for example, that castigate Timarchus for whorishness, 142 or 154, among others, underline his willing choice and desire to be an in-house lover, not simply an outdoor prostitute, devoting himself to the lewd desires of men older than him, because he was a slave to the most shameful lust, to extravagance at table. Willing desire, driven by insatiable lust and extravagant consumption of luxury goods, is one of the most characteristic and fundamental features of Echinaidos, as discussed among other sources in Plato's Symposium, Gorgias, and Phaedrus. Plato quite notably is concerned with the moral aspects in the behavior and the character of Echinaidos, underlining his inclination towards intemperate pleasures and insatiable consumption. Kinaidia is also connected with whorishness because of venality. Archilochus, fragment 328, is notable in presenting Echinaidos as a bad prostitute, as being delighted to get paid. This may, in fact, be the womanish hamartia Timarchus is accused of in section 185 of speech 1 of Aeschines, that he treated his male body as if it was womanish, receiving money to act as a prostitute. This implies most of all that he is penetrated, despite this accusation never being openly leveled against Timarchus, without caring of his lovers, who are only used as paymasters of his own disgusting lust. It is interesting that Archilochus, fragment 327, presents another similarity between the Kinaidos and the prostitute, in that both are presented as constantly seeking for lovers, a feature of Timarchus that is made clear in speech 1. Also, there is a Greek term, deluria, or deliria in my modern Greek pronunciation of the term, which is a description of the body in decay, which is the image of Timarchus in 126 and in 12 other instances in the speech. It is argued by Maud Gleason to be embodying badge of Echinaidos. So, even bad prostitute and Echinaidos share the same markers of embodied and moral decadence, and given that Timarchus is presented as a bad prostitute, the deductive conclusion is that he has Kinaitic qualities. It is perhaps because of this conclusion and the general perception among the Athenians of Timarchus's Kinaitic nature and behavior that Aeschines does not take great pains to make the accusation against him as clear as is that against Demosthenes, when he uses the word kinaidos to describe him. Speakers did not argue for the evident, but they rather explained the unclear, trying to increase the acceptability of their arguments to the audience. In 151, Aeschines openly accuses Demosthenes of lacking the bodily, sexual, and gender qualities of a male, as exemplified by his brother-in-law, Philon, the hoplite. While in section 88 of the same speech, the speaker also refers, albeit implicitly, to the use of the mouth of the kinaidos to carry out fellatio, an action that pollutes the mouth and figuratively the speech of an individual and renders him ineligible and unqualified to participate in political affairs. The kinaidos is described as the somatized and moral opposite to the real male, as exemplified by the ideal of the hoplite and the athlete. Now, textual sources combined with non-textual ones help us reconstruct an image of the physicality of both types of figures, the kinaidos and the hoplite, and the athlete, of course. Pindar, for example, refers to the beauty and strength of the athletic body that made it the object of general admiration. Lucian talks about manly perfection, physical beauty, wonderful condition, mighty skill, irresistible strength, indomitable resolution, and inexpressible desire for victory. And Dio Chrysostom praises two probably not real athletes for the beauty of their bodies, which are like statues. The Book of Physiognomy, a work by an unknown author, probably dated to the end of the 4th century AD, describes in ekphrastic detail, so here the passage, describes in ekphrastic detail the masculine body and general physiognomy. It is notable that, as indicated in sources, a beautiful and strong body is the natural habitat of virtue. No wonder then that the opposite, the kinaitic body, is tarnished both by lack of harmony and moral and socio-political virtue. The athletic body was suffused with attributes such as strength, energy, endurance, and virtue, which were expected, and if we believe the honorary documents, exhibited not merely by successful athletes, but also by competent and generous public figures and benefactors. Now, non-textual material evidence, such as the Kroisos Kouros, a marble statue of a muscled young warrior, and discus thrower, a statue that was made by the Greek sculptor Myron in the 5th century BC, are also of some use in figuring out the physical appearance of the hoplite. The Kroisos Kouros specifically presents a man standing in a frontal posture, with his left foot slightly advanced, powerful thighs and shin bones shown with acute lines. His waist is narrow and his thoracic arch is wider and fleshier than other Kouroi. Now, colleagues, one of the greatest challenges we classicists have to cope with is to transfer images and ideas of the past to the present, to the contemporary world. So now, trying to achieve this purpose, I have to present to you two images that come close to the ideal, to the image of the Kroisos Kouros. And you are going to choose which one of the two comes indeed closer. Are you ready for the next slide? Yes. Are you there? Okay. You're not sleeping? Okay. So now you have two representations of Kroisos Kouros in the 21st century. And we shall have a vote after the end of the session, which one comes closer to the image of Kroisos Kouros. But I have a third option for you to choose. Are you ready for the next slide?
Yeah.
It is a bit shocking, but just to have a third option, perhaps, something like that. Okay, let us go to Pseudo-Aristotle instead, because I think this slide is a bit horrible. Aristotle, in his work on physiognomy, also describes the physique of the brave man, which coincides with that of the Kouros and stands in sharp contrast with the physique of the coward that is like that of the Cneidos. Lucian offers a succinct description of Myron's discus thrower, while Philostratus, an important orator and sophist in Roman imperial courts, also offers information about the statue. I very much like happy audiences whenever they are listening to lectures about ancient Greek philology and indeed oratory. But the corporeality, sexuality, and gender identity of the Cneidos and their perception by the social and cultural community are more complicated than the above linear descriptions. So those that attribute only one physique to passive homosexuals with no divergences or variations whatsoever. Some passages present the Cneidos almost as having the same physical qualities as the ideal athletic and hoplitic male. Diogenes Laertius, for example, refers to a story of a Cneidos who had been brought up hearty, exercising in a gymnasium. He controlled his body so well that there was no evident sign of the physical tendencies that were attributed to Cneidoi in ancient sources and which would allow other people to identify their sexuality and gender identity. It is important to mention the gymnasium, the mention of the gymnasium in this context. That was the place where acute physicality was mingled with moral, social, and political excellence. A similar passage describing a Cneidos as being impressive in physique is Dio Chrysostom. So the Cneidos in both passages had no evident physical, kinetic, or behavioral divergence from any other man in the immediate community. In both passages, what reveals the sexual identity and gender of the athlete is sneezing. That there is an association between the nose, genitals, and masculinity is well attested in ancient Greek texts and inscriptions, as I argue elsewhere. But what exactly in the act of sneezing allows a physiognomist named Cleanthes to attribute kinaidia to a male is untold. It is my view that sneezing leaves the sneezer unable to control embodied performance. Unconscious and involuntary vocal and perhaps also physical actions that may, for example, be indicated by hand gestures allow the physiognomist to recognize the Cneidos and attribute to him the quality of being effeminate or enfimbled, even if these are not explicitly mentioned in the text. People categorize individuals as gay or heterosexual on the basis of indirect cues, including their physical appearance, body language, and vocal characteristics. Cognitive researchers also argue that homosexuality can be detected through the examination of facial expressions and characteristics. Ancient sources corroborate this modern interdisciplinary view. Aristotle, or actually pseudo-Aristotle in physiognomics, refers to the high and slack voice of the effeminate, while the Book of Physiognomy refers to the tendency of passive homosexuals towards hiding their sexual identity, which is, however, revealed when they lower their neck and voice and relax their hands, or when they use their sharp and soft voices, or their voice that sounds as if it had been broken. So, if the man who sneezes produces inadvertently and unconsciously a sound that was close to the description of the voice of the Cneidoi, and if he carries his hands palm upward and slack to recall physiognomics, then his sexual identity and gender are revealed to a physiognomist. And from sneezing, let us go to flatulence. Flatulence is another inarticulate mode of bodily expression that indicates, arguably, the sexual and gender identity of individuals. This is, in my view, a possible reading of the controversial reference in Aristophanes' Wealth 176 to Agirias, a significant political figure in Athenian affairs, as breaking wind. Personification of the god of wealth, Plutus, has a conversation with Cremillus and Charion when the latter asks, "Is it not because of him, because of Plutus, that Agirias farts?" Wilfred Major brilliantly stresses the link of this line with the socioeconomic status of Agirias and his authority in political speech-making. An orator in action delivering a speech can be said to be farding. I don't dare to share any contemporary photos of this very old idea because I would have a plethora of images to show, really, right? Major, in line with the Scholia in Aristophanes by John Tzetzes, which take flatulence as an indication of excessive wealth, argues for the connection between farding and Agirias's elite social and economic class, which maximized his desire for more wealth. Flatulence seems, in fact, to symbolize Agirias's steadfast will to overcome economic difficulties and become rich. It is also true that there is, in Greek as well as in Roman literature, an established and recurrent pattern of metaphorical association between wealth and bodily actions of the lowest kind. This slide of my PowerPoint presentation puts some flesh on the bones of theory. But Major does not agree with the suggestion made in the Scholia that the reference to flatulence may be an indication of Agirias's sexual identity, especially his homosexuality. It is true that the implied connection between Wealth 176 and Assembly Women 102, where we are told that Agirias has deceived everyone thanks to the birth of Pronomus, yet he was no better than a woman, does not quite reveal anything about the presentation of Agirias as breaking wind. It is also true that the Scholia are not always the best sources of information about Aristophanes and his era. But it is interesting, in my view, that there is a silent alignment between, first, the desire for wealth and luxury for which Agirias seems to be satirized in Wealth and in the Scholia, and second, the markers of the behavior of Echinaidos, specifically the insatiable consumption of luxury goods. So we can see this sort of logical equation. It is perhaps for this reason that Agirias is accused of effeminacy in the Scholia, one of the most notable characteristics of Echinaidos and defining one of his nature and his sexual identity. The link between sexual and individual identity is also made in oratory. The clothing of Demosthenes, about which Aeschines makes the devastating point in 131 that it is indistinguishable from womanish attire, is an indication of wealth and luxury of the sort that recalls Timachus's problematic relationship with sex, wealth, and self-restraint. It is not argued, of course, that Agirias breaks wind because of his wealth or his homosexuality, a line of interpretation that Major rightly rejects, but rather that his behavior has stark similarities with the moral and materialistic features of the description of the Echinaidos in ancient sources. Farding in context may well be then an innuendo about Agirias's homosexual identity, and a well-made one in my view. The reference to flatulence may work on several levels, underlining, for example, the arrogance and insolence of socioeconomic elites, which is what the Scholia suggests, and aiming crudely but forcibly to present the image of the mocked individual in order to create allusions to the excessive life he lives and his sexual identity, which both put him on the margins of the community. Aristophanes, in other words, refers to flatulence to instill in the mind of the Athenian theatergoers the image of an anus, inviting them to think of Agirias's rumored attraction to anal pleasure and of the dimensions this attraction may have, with a specific reference to the consumption of luxury goods that the socioeconomic status of Agirias allows and Kinaidia is defined by. So don't worry, I'm coming to the end. I hope it becomes evident that interpreting silent language in both textual and non-textual language, in textual and non-textual sources is a meaningful process that can reveal a lot about the sexual and gender identity of individuals and the values, perceptions, and attitudes that upheld ancient societies. Any enterprise of deciphering the cultural beliefs and values of people in the past It's like visiting a magnificent house in the absence of its residents. We have inevitably to cope with silence, but we can make observations of everything around us. We can learn a lot about the residents from the grand and ostentatious parts of the property, the kitchen, the living room, the garden, but we can learn just as much, if not more, their character, their needs, their way of life from the toilet. So discussing about sneezing and flatulence, or about urination and defecation, as in a forthcoming monograph, has the potential to reveal gender and identity, and it does also have the potential to reveal identity in general. So when bodily silence speaks, it has a lot to say. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for that wonderful paper, which I think lived up to everything I said about you in the introduction and more in its range and its richness. What we did last week was we had the second paper immediately following the first, and then joint Q&A. So if you're happy with that, I think we'll do that, just to kind of encourage people to make links between the two presentations. So I don't know if, Peter, you want to come and start getting your presentation set up. So Peter Olive is a home team. He's at St. Cat's, where he's reading for a DPhil on incest, which is obviously a fascinating topic, and very surprising that no one's really done a study of this in Greek literature before, because as anyone who's read any Greek literature will know, they are quite obsessed with it. So a topic full of interest and full of relevance, obviously, for our seminar. And yeah, I'll just hand you straight over. Have you got everything that you
need to share my screen? I'll just do that.
Fantastic. So I'll just hand you straight over to Peter.
Start my timer. Super. Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Sarah, for the invitation, and thank you also, Andreas, for such a stimulating paper, especially with this emphasis on the involuntary and indeed bodily effluvia and things, which actually makes it's going to be quite complementary with what I've got to say. So I think I'm going to begin with a quotation, and then I shall explain where all this is going. So I'm hoping everyone who's online can hear me. Please put a note perhaps in the chat if you can't, and we will run out. Super. Okay, so in an awkward speech by Andocides from 399 BC against his cousin Callias III, Andocides condemns some domestic goings-on that sound extraordinary by anyone's standards. In his counterclaim to a charge of impiety at the Mysteries, Andocides' witness relates how Callias III married the daughter of Ischomachus. In less than a year, Callias also began an affair with the girl's mother, Chrysilla. So he's in bed with a mother and a daughter concurrently. The daughter tried to hang herself and eventually ran away. Later, the mother is driven away as well, but subsequently reveals that she's pregnant. Now, Callias is a priest at the cult of Demeter and Persephone, in fact heavily emphasized in the story, and in his priestly duties, Callias is required to preside over the baby's rights. He denies paternity. Some years later, he falls back in love with the mother and presents the boy, now grown, to the Cherokees as his legitimate son by Chrysilla. So this is item number 1 on the handout. And the handout, by the way, is exactly the same as the PowerPoint. So, most shameless of all men, Callias cohabited with mother and daughter, though priest of mother and daughter, and he kept both together in his house. There are 3 women with whom the son will have lived, and he is the alleged son of one of them, the brother of another, and the uncle of a third. What ought a son like that to be called, asked the speaker, Oedipus or Aegisthus? Okay, so today I have 2 objectives that spring from this as a starting point. So the first is to test the limits of the incest taboo in classical Athens. And to do so, I'm going to consider a nimbus of uncategorized sexual practices that were discussed in the law courts by reference to the myths of Oedipus and Thyestes. So you all know the story of Oedipus. The Thyestes story is not so well known. It was dramatized as a very horrible story involving sexual violence. Thyestes raped his own daughter, Pelopeia. The resulting child, as you didn't know, was Aegisthus. So it's clear enough that to sleep with one's in-laws, with one's step-parent or step-child, as in the Phaedra story, or with two generations of the same family, would all have been unorthodox, and in some sense at least, taboo. What I want to ask is how such taboos were actually constituted, how they were reified, and indeed, do the boundaries of taboo remain consistent? So I'd like to look for what I call the threshold of intensities, the point at which the merely unorthodox tips over into the taboo, and on various phenomena as well cluster around that threshold and draw attention to it. And by that I mean stories that involve a perceived transgression, or stories that go out of their way to make something sound acceptable when it's perhaps rather borderline. The second objective is to test a theory devised by French anthropologist Françoise Héritier about the underlying principles that give rise to such distinctions between the acceptable and the unacceptable. These principles might be sensed only at a very visceral level, rather than being the product of collective thought at the level of the polis. So taboos can be very intangible, so I thought we could use this as a sort of experiment in the epistemology, if you will, of taboo, how far we can reconstruct them. So this is where we need the theory, which I'll come to in a minute. But before I go any further, I should probably introduce my understanding of the incest taboo. Very important to say this next bit, because somebody always asks. The ancient Greeks did not understand a biological rationale against incest. Occasionally they look as though they're going to, but they don't. So I strongly suspect their thinking on this subject was really quite different to ours. I suggest that prior to Darwin's discovery that incest has ill effects on the offspring, that the taboo against incest had a sort of two-stage etiology, constantly being renewed from one generation to the next. So the first is a sort of visceral response that manifests almost universally by a certain age if a sexual advance were made within the family. And this visceral feeling I've called an affect. That's the only reason I've used this word in the title. By affect, all I mean is an involuntary response to a stimulus, like the sight of blood or the smell of decay, something that doesn't really go via the brain, something that precedes understanding. The phenomenon of sexual indifference to our closest relatives is sometimes called the Westermarck effect, after the man who discovered it. It's sufficiently widespread, this effect, to bring about the second component of the incest taboo, wherein a prohibition comes to be recognised at the level of the whole society, where the state outlaws sex between relatives of a certain degree, and of course that's the bit that can vary. So in many parts of the world you can marry your first cousin. And this can even vary within a culture. So in some states of America, you can marry your first cousin. In other states, you cannot. Now, in most societies, that bit of the prohibition gets codified in scripture, in law, or in both. In this sense, classical Athens is quite unusual. The incest taboo doesn't seem to have been written down. Plato and Xenophon both refer to the prohibition against incest as a nomos agraphos, and I suspect we should take them literally there. Therefore, the instrumentality of incest myths in shaping public thought is really not to be underestimated. There does seem to have been a consensus, though, that in classical Athens, incest means either coitus between parents and children, or imaginably grandparents and grandchildren, or between siblings from the same womb. So two half-siblings with a common father could in fact get married, and we do have one or two instances of this. Now, Oedipus and Thyestes committed incest with their mother, Jocasta, and daughter Pelopeia, respectively, but the references that we see to them in the Attic law courts, as well as comedy, covered a much wider range of sexual misdemeanours, including, as we've already seen, cross-generational partner sharing, what we're about to see later, sexual abuse of slaves, and even simply unorthodox age differentials. It's easy enough to dismiss the law court comparisons as an invective trope, and I will do shortly. But the speech by Androcrates I began with nonetheless prompts us to think more deeply about taboos and how taboos are constituted. Now for the theory. In a book of 1994, French anthropologist Françoise Héritier argued for a broader understanding of the incest taboo, which she called incest of the second type. Citing evidence from cultures around the globe, Héritier argued that in order to integrate all known aspects of the incest taboo, one must focus not just on bodies, but on the contact and passage of bodily effluvia, bodily fluids, from one body to another. So I give you her definition, which I don't think I need to read out. It's essentially what I've just said. The way I explain this quickly is with the Tudors. How do you solve a problem like Catherine of Aragon? Well, when Henry VIII was trying to divorce the poor woman, one of the arguments put forward to the Vatican was that because she'd already been married to Henry's brother, Prince Arthur, now dead, that the marriage to Henry had been incestuous all along. At least it is according to a passage from Leviticus, but contra a passage from Deuteronomy. The argument didn't work. Anyway, it's just a way of thinking about it. According to Héritier, the affects that give rise to this and similar prohibitions worldwide arise from a feeling, really, between two brothers, an affect, that if a woman being is shared between two brothers, there is the mixing of their bodily fluids, real or imagined, and that at some deep or ineffable level, this feels like a kind of homosexual incest. Now, scholars have found a great many flaws with Héritier's theory. Yet, all of her critics have acknowledged that in spite of the faults, her theory has much to recommend it, not least because countless taboos worldwide arise from concerns about hygiene and bodily effluvia. So today I'm going to argue that incest of the second type is certainly not recognised at the level of the Athenian polis, certainly not at any cognitive or metacognitive level, but that certain individuals, including even the poet of the Iliad, or at least of certain passages in Book 9, do seem to have understood the concept that Héritier calls incest of the second type. So before I go any further, I'll just acknowledge why the examples from the law courts have quite limited value for proving Héritier's theory. She leaned very heavily on them. Androcles' closing question, what are we to call a boy like that, might seem reasonable. You could certainly be forgiven for losing track of who's who in a state of affairs like that. But of course, that's Androcles' intention. Unlike Oedipus and Thyestes, Callias is not actually set with any blood relatives. Such shifts from narrative detail to mythological generalities were somewhat formulaic in the course, and it's hardly surprising to find orators seeking to blur perceptual distinctions like that. And one can go further. Metaphor theorists have convincingly shown that metaphors often evolve from similes, and as time passes, they cease to be used to compare, but to categorize. And we can see this happening. So in 5th and 4th century rhetoric as well as comedy, the names of Oedipus and Thyestes are in this process of conventionalization. They're becoming synonymous with intrafamilial dysfunction. Even in comedy, so for example, one of these sexually voracious old ladies towards the end of Ecclesiastes is compared indirectly with Jocasta. The only point of correspondence is an age gap between her and the young man she's praying with. And I'll give you another example from the law courts. In a speech of uncertain authorship, an attempt is made to deplore Alcibiades' conception of a boy conceived with a slave girl he bought from Milos. So the author, here called Pseudo-Androcles, will compare the boy to Aegisthus, assimilating the enslaved woman to Pelopeia. So he had a son with her, the Melian slave, child whose birth was more unnatural than Aegisthus's, since he has sprung from parents who are each other's deadliest enemies and his nearest kin. The one has committed and the other suffered the most terrible wrongs. Plutarch's Life of Alcibiades gives us a bit of context there. When Alcibiades chose one of the Melian prisoners of war to be his mistress, people call this an act of philanthropy, Plutarch tells us, but Alcibiades had voted for the deaths of all Melian men. So it's a very horrible story, but there's no sense of consanguinity there, or even relationship by marriage. So you can see the names of Oedipus and Thyestes, they are being used to categorize all sorts of sexual situations that might result in social disapproval. So incest of the second type can be part of that range, but we can't prove Héritier's theory just with examples from oratory. So next I'm going to try out, I'm going to test the premise of Erythier's theory by examining this precondition that might sound rather absurd of homosexual incest. So Erythier explains that the origins of her theory lie in the claim made by social anthropologist Ray of Fortune in 1932 that the concept of incest might just as well refer to homosexual as heterosexual contact. So I'm going to look for evidence that this might have been a recognised concept in Athens. I don't think, by the way, that recognition of this as a concept is an essential condition for Erythier's theory, but I certainly think if we find it, it strengthens the foundations of the theory, especially since I expect to a lot of people the concept of homosexual incest probably sounds absurd. Sure enough, we do find evidence of such unease in Greek antiquity. So in the process of criticising Plato's ideal state in Politics 2, this is item 5 on the handout, Aristotle objects to the thought, which he calls most unseemly after Pestaton, of pederasty between fathers and sons, or between brothers. And not dissimilarly, the Alcibiades of Plato's Symposium articulates an emergent property of a homosexually understood incest taboo. So when Alcibiades describes his hotly anticipated but disappointingly sexless night with Socrates, he all but articulates the Westermarck hypothesis, this idea that we become sexually desensitized, sexually indifferent to our closest relatives. All that makes his utterance unusual is that it refers to the same-sex attraction. So he says, "You may be sure by God that when I arose I had in no more particular sense slept a night with Socrates than if it had been with my father or my elder brother." So to me, these pieces of evidence suggest that the definition of incest I began with is not the only one operating in ancient minds, even if these are quite unusual sets of circumstances. So, with respect to the passage I began with from Andocrates, the phenomenon Erythier described is very hard to disentangle from other taboos, most obviously polygamy and moicheia. So to test Erythier's theory, I'm going to need a method that isolates the putative incest of the second type from these concomitant circumstances. So I'm now going to examine some plots that depend on the affective potential of incest of the second type in situations where concerns about moicheia or polygamy have already been discounted. So I'll start with a scenario from Iliad 9, in which adultery, which is normally a concomitant concern when you're having sex with your in-laws, is already accounted for. So in the first part of his speech in the delegation to Achilles, this is slides 447 to 77 of Iliad 9, Phoenix explains how he was persuaded by his mother to sleep with his father's new concubine in advance of his father doing so. Phoenix's mother, by the way, is never named by the poet of the Iliad, but we'll call her Hippodamia, as she's called in the A Scholia. So Hippodamia's intention is expressed in a purpose clause. And she endlessly beseeched me by the need to sleep with the concubine first, in order that she might hate the old man. Old man's in the accusative, naturally enough for a hate verb. Like several other details in Phoenix's lengthy tale, the logic of Hippodamia's plan is inexplicit. An explanation noted in the BT Scholia is simply that after sex with an youthful Phoenix, the concubine will detest the older man. But it is unclear how this would benefit Hippodamia, not least since the feelings and consent of concubines hardly seem to matter in the world of the Iliad. Consent and concubines, these are not really compatible concepts. Agamemnon's confiscation of Briseis hardly depended on her affection any more than his forcible possession of Cassandra did in Aeschylus. As Stephanie West notes in the very brilliant article on your handout, the reasoning behind Hippodamia's plan may have been scrutinised in antiquity, since the P. Scholia record a variant guarantee. Much depends on the degree of transitivity to be understood from the verb. Ektheria is active, but ekphiro, or at least apekphiro, can mean both hate someone in the accusative and make X, something in the accusative, hateful to Y, something or someone, in the dative. So I will show you the example that Stephanie West has found from the Odyssey. So here we have apekphire, Menelaus speaking. one who makes me loathe sleep and food when I remember him. So we've got the person affected in the dative, person hated still in the accusative. So, the causative sense. Now I shall start that again. Some scholars have been keen to accept this emendation. So Hainsworth, for example, in his Cambridge commentary, is interested in this. The effect of Phoenix's action, he says, would have been to alienate the Geron, not the Palakis. The causative sense of make her hateful to the old man would imply a lower degree of transitivity for the old man, which might explain why some wrote Geronti in the dative rather than Gerontar in the accusative. I am in two minds about this. This is what we've got in the Townley Scholium. So write Geronti in order that she may be hated. Here we've got a dative of the agent, less than ideal. I find it a bit strange. I am not really, I'd love to know what people think in the questions of whether people think the Greek can support this. I am in two minds, but what I absolutely think is that the story makes much more sense if we start thinking about incest of the second type. If we start thinking that Hippodamia's intention is to make the father think, no, I can't sleep with her now because my son's already been in bed with her, and this just feels in some sense taboo. So, if all of this seems far-fetched, it might be worth noting that long before the advent of social anthropology, Alexander Pope understood that coitus between the girl and Phoenix meant that Amintor could no longer consummate his new relationship without it being an act of incest. So this is from Pope's Iliad commentary from round about 1720. Now, I have absolutely no doubt that Pope's interest in this partly reflects the preoccupations of his own age. There's no doubt about that. But there's even another story, which I don't feel I got to the bottom of, and I would like people's thoughts about. Plutarch tells us that Aristarchus, out of fear for Laertes, emphasised the lines that follow, lines in which Phoenix contemplated killing his father. So they were reinstated by Friedrich Wolff as lines 458 to 61. Scholars have generally been more concerned about the authenticity of the lines than in the kind of fear that led Aristarchus to excise them. Why might Aristarchus have been afraid? So I don't know if I'm just overthinking things here, but I'm interested in what's going on in Aristarchus's immediate media. So Aristarchus worked under various different Ptolemies in his time at Alexandria. I'm particularly interested in Ptolemy VIII, the one who eventually forced Aristarchus to leave Alexandria, because he was also in bed with two generations of the same family at the same time. And he didn't kill his father, although various of his predecessors were rumoured to have committed patricide, but he did kill his son. So because when I was drawing this up, I started to really doubt myself, because this is the kind of thing structuralists do. Put everything in a chart so it looks really convincing, and leave anything out of the chart that doesn't look so convincing. It doesn't fully work, but we do have two people. We have Ptolemy VIII, Aristarchus' boss, if you will, and the concubine, both in bed with two members of the same family, and we have massive violence and discord. So Ptolemy VIII, I actually checked this morning because I couldn't believe it, had not one but two of his children killed. He killed his own son, and brace yourself, it's horrible if you don't know this, posted the body parts back to the mother of that child, which was Cleopatra II, as a birthday present. So I just wonder if there's something of that, if the violence mixed with this cross-generational partner sharing might somehow explain that little anecdote. Just an item of curiosity, really. Okay, time is short, so let's turn to tragedy. Anxieties about combinations of bodily fluids are very seldom made explicit in classical Athens, at least in tragedy, but an unusual use, rather, of the word homosporos in Oedipus Tyrannus is worthy of mention. This word normally refers to siblings or just to blood relatives, homosporos. Let's get these in front of us. So, in his address to Tiresias, Oedipus uses the word homosporos to describe Jocasta. Now, this is an unusual use. So, obviously, he doesn't realise at the time that he's shared the bed with his own father. Patrick Finglas has translated it as the wife who shares our seed. Later in the play, when Tiresias has really lost his patience with Oedipus, he uses homos poros in a much more pejorative sense. Here in Hendiadys, I think, with the phoneus. Now, Sophocles is, of course, celebrated for his use of ambiguous language and for demonstrating the inadequacies of language in achieving shared understanding. So I think it would be unwise to take a catachretic use of a single word as evidence that incest of the normal kind and Erythie's incest of the second type were one of the same to the audience. She's very interested in this bit in her book. I'm a bit wary of that reading, but nonetheless it's clear that the concept of being fellow sower, as used there by Tiresias, at least in that context, has potential to be stigmatizing. However, elsewhere in the same author, we see that a wife can be handed from father to son consensually. So in the epilogue to Sophocles' Trachiniae, it is item 10 on the handout, Hylas expresses horror at Heracles' dying and insistent request that he marry his father's concubine, Iole. In the context of the play, it's clear that the transfer of Iole from father to son is non-reversible. Heracles' death by euthanasia with the help of his son is imminent. Heracles' request has puzzled scholars, but most rationalize it in relation to the character of the self-absorbed Heracles. And when viewed in terms of alliance theory, the apparent double standard makes a bit more sense. So as Charles Seagal notes in the article in your handout, Heracles' use of the verb labe and various other features of the language suggests a language of gift exchange. Quote, Heracles envisages Iole as a possession to be handed over between men. But I haven't advanced the thing. There's nothing in particular on the language I want to comment on, actually. The emphasis on the father's authority and on the son's eventual obedience reinforce that sense of a patriarchal order. Such concerns seem to eclipse any sense of aversion to this indirect sexual contact between father and son. Were she still alive, she died in 2017, Erythie may have responded that since Hylas will marry Iole only after his father's death, there's minimal risk of their bodily effluvia mixing. Comparable examples can be found at the level of the brother, or brother-in-law rather. So in Euripides' Andromache, Thetis ex machina foretells Andromache's future marriage to Hector's full brother, Helenus, as later elaborated by Virgil in Aeneid 3. If the never really thought about logic, the inexplicit logic, the affective logic runs that such marriages are acceptable after the death of a father or a sibling, on the basis that the father or sibling's bodily fluids cannot circulate further after death, then that's never made explicit. But the difference in attitudes to non-reversible wife transfers and concurrent partner sharing is attested quite consistently. So we can contrast these, I think, with the superlative in the Androcrates passage at the beginning, hop anton sketliotatos anthropon, the use of the imperfect implying the simultaneous partner sharing. Okay, last little section. Taboos often draw most attention to themselves at precisely the moment they get revised. If someone made the decision that political expedience took priority over some squeamishness about bodily fluids, i.e. some taboo that was hardly even articulated and less still understood, it may well have seemed necessary to defend, excuse, or rationalise those revised priorities. So I'll now turn to a story from the Hellenistic period whose romanticised qualities suggest, to me at least, that it may have been contrived with just that kind of a purpose in mind. And this I shall illustrate with a painting. The painting itself is unimportant, I just thought it would be nice to have a visual stimulus. Okay, so it's quite a famous story, but I shall just summarise this for those who don't know it. The legendary marriage of Stratonice of Syria to her stepson is supposedly a true story. Set in 294 BC, the tale of Seleucus I ceding his wife, Stratonice, the wife, to his son on bed, Antiochus, I've lost my place, is told in detail by Plutarch and Appian, and more briefly by several other authors. There are lots and lots of authors. Item number, the last item on your handout gives you a list of authors, should you like to go and look at these texts. But Erasistratus, the resourceful doctor on the chair at Seleucus's court, manages to establish what's wrong when the young man, Antiochus the son, falls ill. He's fallen in love with his stepmother, Stratonike. And in case you're wondering, the father's marriage to Stratonike had certainly been consummated. Unlike Phoenix's affair with the concubine, they had a child together, Plutarch tells us, and inscriptions reveal that she was a girl. Whether that's significant, I don't know, but they certainly slept together. In Plutarch's version, which is one of the longest, Erasistratus, this crafty doctor, adopts a ruse. So in explaining to the father what the problem is, the doctor says, "I'm afraid your son's condition is incurable. He's going to die. Why? Because he's in love with my wife." So Seleucus begs the doctor to hand over his wife to the ailing Antiochus. And the doctor responds that Seleucus would hardly hand over his wife, Stratonike, if the boy were in love with her. And as correctly anticipated, Seleucus refutes this, saying, "No, I would hand over my kingdom and my wife if that would save my son's life." And of course, the doctor has judged everything quite correctly. He reveals the truth. Seleucus summons the army, and the transfer of wife and kingdom is made. Antiochus marries his stepmother. Though the marriage and the succession are apparently historical, our accounts of these events unfold like a fable, containing a lesson about priorities. And in Lucian's version, Seleucus explicitly articulates those priorities. To lose a wife is not the same misfortune as to lose a son, says Lucian's Seleucus. Moreover, the story reads like an androcentric rewrite of the Hippolytus myth, with, of course, a happy ending. An obvious difference being the gender of two of the participants. So this tale features a young man and a young woman who's ill and preferring death to disclosing his passion, and Euripides' blabbermouth nurse gets replaced by a shrewd-witted medical man. Suicide is averted, and power is successfully passed from father to son. Who shaped this narrative originally, and more importantly, why did it need to be told? We can only theorize. But, I argue, it is surely significant that Seleucus was, like the Ptolemies, Macedonian in origin. Macedonian kings tended to practice polygamy, and already by the late 5th century, we see evidence of Macedonian rulers marrying the widows of their predecessors, even if that meant marrying their stepmothers. So for the Seleucids at least, the expedience of such marriage was usually political. Doing so enabled future rival heirs to be neutralised, as well as an appearance of continuity in the succession. Moreover, Macedonian kings made very strategic use of matrimonial alliances. So Seleucus' marriage to Stratonike in the first place had been a matrimonial alliance with Demetrius. And of course, once all this had happened, there was probably very little Demetrius could do, even if he objected to the variation to the terms of their arrangement. So the Seleucids might nonetheless have been conscious that their ways must have seemed unorthodox in the wider Greek world. In most Greek minds, polygamy was considered a foreign practice, and the Macedonians' claim to Hellenicity had long been disputed. Would it be far-fetched to theorise that the tale of Antiochus and Stratonike was put about as a conscious response to Euripides' Hippolytus? I say probably not. As with Alexander the Great, the posthumous reputation of Seleucus seems to have been expertly curated, and other legends about Seleucus are characterised by a pattern of responding to or reworking existing stories in the Greek tradition. In any case, they had a personal relationship with Euripides that they were probably quite proud of. Euripides had enjoyed a guest friendship with Archelaus I towards the end of his life, and even wrote a play about him. So Euripides had already shaped Macedonian heritage in some ways. Whatever the origins of this strange story, the unorthodox marriage is consistently presented as auspicious, medically endorsed, and like our example from Trachiniae, thoroughly androcentric. Since Seleucus' family already practiced polygamy, and the trust between father and son shows us that concerns about moicheia are already minimised, I suggest it's possible that the story responded to public unease at the thought of incest of the second type overwriting such concerns with this beguiling, if you find it beguiling, tale of male bonding with the patriarchal order affirmed. So, in conclusion, we've seen that Héritiers' concept, incest of the second type, may have value in providing what I find an attractive rationale for Hippodamia's scheme in Iliad 9 and for the T-Scolion's emendation. Arguably, the story is not quite coherent without it. Less urgently, Héritiers' theory also helps explain why, in myths, paternally sanctioned wife transfers seem to have been acceptable only at the point of a father or a brother's death. Whilst the incest taboo does seem to have maintained an agreed boundary in classical Athens, we've observed that human instincts were not wholly bound by legal limits in their operation, so the concept of a homosexual incest taboo is attested. In general, though, the definition of incest in Athens seems to remain stable, no doubt partly thanks to the role of taboos in strengthening group identity. So Greek playwrights and thinkers portrayed Persians as perpetrators of incest, and by using the incest taboo to distinguish between self and other, Greek authors have reinforced their aversion to deeds that would be threatening in their own society. And it's in that spirit, I think, that figures like Oedipus and Thyestes are used not so much for articulating existing taboos, but for creating stigma around misdeeds that had little or no typological precedent. As the most recognisable figures in the terrain of sexual deviance, their misdeeds came to typify familial dysfunction, broadly construed, I argue, by appealing to the same affective response created by the thought of incest. So though they're separable from the unorthodox couplings I've discussed, incest serves as their organising principle. It's at the foot of the slippery slope upon which orators place their targets. Héritiers' theory remains fraught with problems, but in Athens at least, I suggest it provides a remarkably coherent rationale for public attitudes that otherwise appear to be inconsistent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that fantastic talk. So wide-ranging and also beautifully delivered. Andreas, I don't know if you want to pop back on so that people can see you. Maybe we'll stop sharing the screen as well. Share. You just go back to screen one. You've done something really fancy there.
Yeah, end slideshow, there we go.
There we go. Wonderful. Yeah, floor is open to anybody who wants to ask a question in the room or on Zoom. To either of our speakers or both. Yeah.
I've got a question for Oliver. I was wondering how you thought Phaedra would come into it. Would that come into the second degree, and is it different because the objection is raised by a woman, so there isn't that degree of sharing fluids?
Thank you very much. Yes, I knew someone would ask about Phaedra. I said hardly anything about Phaedra, didn't I? Okay, so you've asked two questions in a way. Is it different for a woman? So I'll come to that in a second, if I may.
Do you want to come to the
Oh yes, of course. I should. Yes, so everyone can hear. So we've had a question about Phaedra and how she comes into all of this. So I'll just repeat the question so that everyone can hear. Phaedra. Often people describe Phaedra's attraction as incestuous, and I have throughout my study of all of this, I have remained conflicted as to whether that is the right classification or not. All I can say is that I think that both views are attested in the ancient world. The word that seems most closely associated with Phaedra is moicheia. Whenever she appears in sort of catalogues of wicked women, in Frogs, for example, or anywhere actually in comedy, we have several references. She is always associated with other people like Stheniboa, for example, with women who are deceitful, with women who lie. And the word, as I say, moicheia, is used about 6 times of her in Thesno, I think it is. Now, I think if we asked an ancient Greek, they would consider it an academic question. Is this incestuous or not? They didn't have a word for this concept, so to them it may have been even slightly more nebulous. than it otherwise seems, which I really do struggle to answer. As for the bodily fluids thing, again, I think that is something that is below the level of cognition. It is something sensed, but not really thought about. And as for your question about her gender, again, I think that is probably why there is this sense of, it being so shocking because she is deceitful. So, there is that line somewhere in Lysias that the seduction is more serious than rape, because it can permanently alienate, the wife. And there are people who've responded to that and said that doesn't necessarily represent the mainstream view. And then there are others. Chris Carey has responded to that, saying actually it's probably not far from the mainstream view. I think that's why Phaedra is so is perceived as so shocking. But I think it is actually a grey area, and I think for me to make a decision is actually the wrong thing to do, because in all my investigations, all I can see is grey area.
Any Zoom questions? Any other questions from the room?
I've got a question for Andreas. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but what inspired you to start investigating sneezing in flatulence?
Catch that, Andreas. Somebody asking what inspired you to start writing about sneezing and flatulence.
Well, I thought that there is a virgin academic field with no systematic work on it. And when I was presenting at a conference I organized at the University of Cyprus with a fantastic name, Sex and the Ancient City, somebody in the audience actually found out that there was a reference in Diogenes Laertius to sneezing. And there was a reference particularly to sneezing that point to sexuality, and then I decided to start working on that. But I soon realized that there's no systematic work on non-volitional body language in general. Non-volitional body language indicates, the reactions of the human body that are at times instigated by agents, that are at times not instigated by them and not controlled by them at all. And I ended up researching on flatulence, urination, defecation, ejaculation, and all these kind of non-volitional bodily actions. And I'm preparing a monograph for Routledge. But that is actually the value of conferences. A good comment on your paper from a participant in the conference may change the route of your research.
Thank you very much. I have a question also for you, Andreas. Thinking about what you said about the physical characteristics of the Kineidos, it struck me that there are some parallels with how the Kineidos is described, with how some men are described in Greek literature who definitely aren't supposed to be a Kineidos. So what was really at the forefront of my mind when you were reading those passages was Paris in the Iliad, and how a lot of his features are coded as effeminate or feminine. And he's obviously criticized for that, but yet he's not kind of being put into that box. So I just wondered if there are more kind of grey areas there of men who are described in this way, but don't quite fit the category of the Kineidos.
Well, Timarchus himself is not called Kineidos in Aeschines 1. And there are many scholars who actually, indeed, Nick Fisher, who actually argue that Timarchus is not emphatically presented as a Kineidos in that speech. I can also think of Agathon in Aristophanes' plays. He has the qualities of Kineidos, but he does not. He's not called Kineidos at all. I mean, the term Kineidos is not used in the context. If we refer to Demosthenes, he's certainly described as Kineidos in many of Aeschines' speeches, indeed in all three speeches, but he once only called the Kineidos in speech 1. So if we think further of how many of many genres and many texts, we can find many other examples, I think.
Thank you very much.
But I don't know if Kinidos, the word Kinidos, was a sort of taboo for the ancients. It is overly offensive. So I suppose it is not used in high frequency by speakers, at least in their law court or assembly orations. So there are implicit descriptions of their adversaries as having the features of kinaidoi, of a kinidos, but the word kinidos is rarely used. I think once or twice in the speeches of Aeschines, and not even once in the speeches of Demosthenes.
Thank you so much. Oh, suddenly got about 8 questions all at once. So I think you had your hand up first.
This is a question for Peter. I don't know if you researched this specifically, but I'm thinking about like the relation there with deities in literature as opposed to mortals. So, I mean, I guess because the concept of incest is different in ancient sources, I don't know if it applies. I mean, we see that like incest as it plays out in myth, I guess mostly is not for deities. It's not treated as much like as a taboo, but I'm wondering if there are cases where this is referenced, like deities committing incest as we understand it, if it is referenced negatively and like how it works with the bodily fluids too, if there is a reference to the bodily fluids.
Thank you very much. So I'll just repeat the question. So we've had a very interesting question about deities and whether concepts of incest apply to them and bodily taboos. Thank you. Yes, I have researched it. There's a few things to say. There are not many passages that problematize for example, the brother-sister marriage of Zeus and Hera, but there are some. Some are fragmentary, but a very obvious one is in Euripides' Heracles. I can send you line references to these things when Heracles is, he says, "Have not the gods joined their couches in ways which nature does not permit?" So there are one or two. Interestingly, Plato worries about the Dias Aparte in the Iliad, but he only seems to be worried about Zeus and Hera deceiving their parents in the early stages of their relationship. So there's some very strange double standards. Then there are some fragments of Callimachus which seem to be problematizing these things, and that leads to the second thing I have to say, which is that there is evidence of at least anxiety at the court of the Ptolemies again, which is of course where our texts are getting edited. So because the Ptolemies, you have brother-sister marriage of Macedonian kings and queens, there seems to be anxiety amongst those who are editing texts about what they can leave in the text, especially since Ptolemy II and his sister, they're using text, they're using Homeric and mythological models to sort of legitimate their rather strange habits. So yeah, there is actually quite a lot going on there. I can send you some stuff should you be curious. Thank you.
This is for Andreas. So when I think of kind of physiognomics and comedy, I primarily think of the studies of masks and new comedy, which has obviously been kind of temptingly put together because the chronology of the physiognomics and late middle to new comedy kind of aligns. How obviously you're transferring that to an earlier period. Is there other evidence that allows us to connect the physiognomics beyond these references to Agerius in prior old comedy?
Did you catch all of that, Andreas?
Well, but pretty much, yes. I'm not expert in new comedy. I cannot give you parallels in new comedy about sexuality, but I think that there is a book coming out by Antonis Petridis, one of my colleagues at the Open University of Cyprus, which is specifically focusing on this topic. I know this is not an answer, really.
No, that's absolutely fine. I think that's a good answer. There's a book coming out. We look forward to the book from your colleagues. Yeah, Eva.
Yeah, this is for Andreas. I was just thinking, because I'm doing early Greek Alexander poetry with Sarah actually at the minute, and it just the semi-volitional kind of bodily kind of fluid vibes, they're all kind of coming together. In the speech in book 1 of the Odyssey, where Telemachus, or maybe book 2, like throws down the staff and like bursts into tears, and there's this like horrible like silence in the agora, because obviously that's like an involuntary kind of non-speech thing, but he's just like finished his speech. So have you found any intersections with like crying and tears? Because obviously now crying is for girls, like things like that. So could you see any of that in the ancient world?
Thanks, that's a great question. Just to summarise, in case you didn't get it, Eva's asking about crying and tears and whether they represent a kind of non-voluntary body language that could also be tied to sexuality or gender, and the modern idea that crying is not for real men, or crying makes you a girl.
This is a stereotype, really. I can tell you that I many times cried in the past for very many reasons. I am not sure I can make the correlation between crying and sexuality. I haven't found any examples of that association in the very many texts I read to prepare, in the process of preparing my monograph. And I don't think that crying is really non-volitional. It may be perhaps semi-volitional from some point of view, but definition there should be clarified. But no, I cannot remember, I cannot recall any such examples. It is a very interesting question, though, for me to further examine.
I think Andreas has just found his next monograph. I think, do we have a question is it from Zoom or from Lewis?
Yes, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you both for really stimulating talks. I had a question for Andreas again about kind of flatulence and sneezing. How culturally specific are these? Do you see these kind of non-volitional markers of the conitis leaking out into, say, Latin literature or elsewhere?
So Lewis would like to know if these non-volitional behaviours of sneezing and flatulence and the negative connotations they carry leak out of Greek culture into other cultures, Latin literature, or anything else that you're aware of?
They are very much culture specific. So there are changes from time to time in antiquity, even changes in the same society from time to time. Athenian of the Athens of the 5th century is not the same as Athens of the 4th century. But what I found out when I was reading those passages to prepare my monograph is that there is an admirably smooth transition from one period to the other, and there is unity and conformity in the ways in which semi-volitional bodily language is described in passages. For example, I can refer to ejaculation, which is described both in the Hippocratic corpus, better say, instead of saying Hippocrates, and Galen in the same way, as driven by sexual desire and by the needs of the body. So I do agree that there is that these elements of the body are culture specific, but there aren't very many and big divergences from culture to culture and from period to period. Was there any other specific part of your question I missed, Sarah?
I think you covered it. I think we've got time for 2 more questions, or 2 or maybe 3 max. So Rhiannon.
Yeah, just a quick one for Peter. I'm just picking up on the point about deities as well. And there's a fantastic moment in Juno's speech at the start of Ovid Fasti 6, where she says it's quite something to be Jupiter's wife and also sister. And I was thinking about similar things actually with deities and the parallel and the double standards. But just to ask about the first passage, Euandrides passage, because it it always seems to be the case, but the problem is that he's a priest. It's not so much anyway that it's the cohabiting. I mean, it's difficult to pin down in some sense. But I wondered what you thought about that. Whether it's actually really the fact that he's a priest and doing this, and that perhaps it would be less of a taboo. I mean, taboos may not be able to exist on a sliding scale, of course, but it was just a thought about the first passage.
Yes, well, thank you very much. No, it's a good thought. I mean, it's certainly very, very emphasised in the text, that he's a priest, the hypocrisy of this man, and of course he has all sorts of other terrible behaviours. So no, I do think that that's very important. And again, this is one of the things that makes taboos hard to study. You can't always separate them. I mean, even with the Alcibiades being compared to Thyestes indirectly when he's having a child with the enslaved woman from Milos, I think that's partly simply because there are so many existing incest allegations against Alcibiades in different authors, in Lysias, and there are some fragments of Antisthenes that make this point. So thank you. That's part of it. And as for the second point about deities, yes, I know that passage from Phaedrus, that Juno, she can't decide if she's more proud, Gloriae, whether she's Jupiter's sister or wife. And in fact, that's a bit of a topos because she begins, which of the plays of Seneca is it? I'm trying to remember. Pardon? Hercules Furens, thank you for reading my mind. Yes, where she says, I shall have to call myself sister, since the title of wife clearly no longer applies. I think that the Romans, in my feeling, the Romans are very amused by the sibling marriages of the gods. They realise that this is a product of literature. I think the Romans are at a sufficient remove that they can make jokes about this kind of thing. In fact, I even threw one in my PowerPoint that I didn't use in the end, but I'll just show you quickly. You may have seen this if you know the Apocolocynthesis. This is about the incest allegation which goes to trial on the very same day that Claudius marries his niece Agrippina the Younger. And this is a story about this man, the very long name, Lucius Junius Silanus Torquatus, accused of sex with his sister. You can go halfway at Athens, all the way at Alexandria. So the Romans love jokes about this kind of thing, and I think that's what the passage from Phaedrus, I think it's in that tradition of making, of smiling wryly about these ridiculous characterizations of the gods.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, so I think just one more question, just so we keep the time. So Tom, I think you were next in the queue. Sorry, James.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. Almost following on from that and Lewis's question about cultural specificity, I was just wondering, especially with the Ptolemies and the Seleucids you were talking about, how much you've looked at local traditions in Egypt or Babylon or elsewhere, and how those might fit in. I know people have talked about the pharaonic traditions, which might or might not be behind the Ptolemies, but you talked about Macedonia and Greece, but I was also wondering if we know much about beyond that as well.
Thank you. The answer to your question is, I'm afraid I've decided they're all much too complicated, and I'm not going to go near them. I'll just summarise why they're so complicated. So, Diodorus Siculus tells us that the Ptolemies adopted Egyptian customs, but in recent years, people have really started to question whether that was actually true. So, you can marry a half sibling in Athens, even though it doesn't seem to have been very common. However, most of the sibling marriages, or the very close kin marriages of the pharaohs, are in fact no closer than the half siblings, so far as we can make out. So it's actually possible that the Ptolemies started all of that, highly controversial, and then there's all of this data on what appears to be the spread of sibling marriage to the entire population in Roman Egypt. Extremely complicated, and there are some articles in JRS in 2007 and then 2008. 2 articles in 2008 absolutely lambasting what's said in 2007, which is that the whole thing might just be some kind of adoption thing. So I'm afraid I don't know the answers, but it's an incredibly interesting field for those who can interpret all of that evidence, which isn't me, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you again to our 2 amazing speakers. Please do stay for a glass of wine if you'd like to, especially if you didn't get the chance to ask your question, but let's just thank Andreas and Peter again. I'm very sorry that you can't join us for wine, Andrea. You have to come again another time.
Next time then.
I'm sorry too. I hope we get to meet him in real life, Andreas. It'll be a real Pleasure.